Leo's reputation in the city's underbelly was legendarily foul, a cocktail of recklessness and sticky fingers. Yet, his striking face was a currency that never devalued, a perfect lure in the dim lighting of downtown dive bars. It consistently drew in men who should have known better, men with wedding rings and bulging wallets who believed they were immune to trouble. He would let them lead him from the bar to a sterile hotel room, and there, amidst the pretense, he'd lift a few hundred from a wallet or pocket something shiny to be pawned later. The score would buy him a few weeks of quiet, of relative peace, before the cycle began anew. It was a sordid enterprise, but it was also survival. The night it all imploded, he met Julian Vance. A deal had gone sideways, and Leo was scrambling for his life. With his face now a liability, he found himself under the patronage of a man who seemed to exist on a different plane of reality. Julian kept him, it was whispered, because Leo's features were a near-perfect echo of an old flame, a ghost from Julian's past. Julian provided a life of quiet luxury, of food that wasn't scavenged and sheets that were always clean. But the old habits, ingrained since childhood, refused to die. On a night Julian was away, the familiar itch returned. Leo found himself back in his old hunting grounds, playing the part. The practiced dance of seduction, the clinking of glasses, the feigned interest, the inevitable hotel room. He returned to Julian's penthouse near dawn, smelling of cheap whiskey and someone else's cologne. He tossed a heavy, gold-banded watch onto the coffee table where Rick was waiting. His father scrambled up from the sofa, his eyes gleaming as he inspected the timepiece. Rick estimated it might fetch 50,000, tops. Leo, already heading for the bedroom, didn't bother to look back. Rick followed him into the room, complaining that for the risk involved, he should aim for bigger fish. Leo just scoffed, telling him he wasn't interested in doing hard time. His father moved to the bedside, pulling the covers off Leo's exhausted body. He spoke of their flexibility, how they could always pack up and vanish, set up in another city if things got hot. Leo turned away, wanting only silence. Rick knelt by the bed, his voice wheedling, pleading for one last big score to set them straight for good. It was a tired refrain. Leo opened his eyes, the irritation flaring. He told Rick that they would be done for good only when his gambling stopped for good. Rick just chuckled, a pathetic mix of charm and desperation. Weary beyond words, Leo finally gave in, making it clear this was the absolute end. Rick promised it was, reaching out to pat his son's head. Leo slapped his hand away. Unfazed, Rick continued, calling Leo a good son, the kind of son who would sell himself so his old man could sit at home and count the cash. The irony was so bitter it was almost funny. This truly was meant to be the last time. But the plan was a setup. Leo escaped by shattering a second-story window, landing hard in the alley below. He ran, heart hammering against his ribs, twisting through a labyrinth of dumpsters and fire escapes. He rounded a corner and slammed directly into a wall of tailored wool and the scent of expensive sandalwood. His heart seized. He knew that scent. Looking up, he saw a face etched with severe, handsome lines, its expression unreadable. Julian Vance stood there, unmoved by the collision, his gaze impassive. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at Leo. He took a step back, pressing himself against the grimy brick wall. The sound of his pursuers grew louder from the end of the alley. Trapped between them and this monolith of a man, Leo's first instinct was to play dumb, to pretend they were strangers. But Julian spoke first, his voice a low baritone that cut through the city noise. He said Leo's name. A nerve twitched in Leo's jaw. He tried to deny it, his voice a hoarse whisper, insisting Julian had the wrong person. Julian's command to come with him was not a request. Leo weighed his options. Being caught by the thugs meant broken bones or worse. It meant jail. Going with Julian was the logical choice, though he couldn't imagine the reception would be warm. No man wants to discover the pet he keeps has a secret life of crime. As they walked toward Julian's car, Leo quietly asked what was going to happen to him. The reply was a single, flatly spoken word. Punishment. A strange wave of relief washed over Leo, a dark thrill at the thought of being disciplined, of being managed. It was a twisted but profound comfort. Back at the penthouse, however, there was no punishment. Julian didn't raise his voice, didn't strike him. He simply had the housekeeper bring a basin of warm water and a soft towel. He knelt and gently, meticulously, cleaned the grime and blood from Leo's hands where he'd fallen. The warmth of the towel was a startling intimacy. Julian then rinsed it and draped the hot cloth over Leo's face. Steam clouded his vision, a soothing blanket against the world. He could feel Julian's presence, so close that if he were to remove the towel, their lips might meet. Julian was unlike anyone else. Others desired his face for what they could take from it. Julian seemed to want the face itself, yet had never laid a hand on him in that way. When the towel was removed, the cool air felt like a shock. Leo's gaze fell. He had to remind himself of the truth, the cold, hard fact of it all. Julian wanted him because he looked like Ethan, the man who had gone abroad. That's why there was a line Julian would never cross. He was a stand-in, nothing more. Julian's voice broke the silence, calling him to the dining table. They sat, the housekeeper and butler having discreetly vanished. The silence in the vast room was heavy. Leo ate without tasting the food, the clink of his fork against the porcelain plate sounding unnaturally loud and oppressive. After a long moment, Julian looked up and asked if the money he gave him wasn't enough. Leo was startled and quickly shook his head. Julian's voice was cool, devoid of anger, but it sent a tremor of fear through him. He asked if Leo understood the gravity of what he was doing. Leo put down his utensils, unable to meet his eyes. Julian pressed him, his voice low and insistent, demanding an answer. Leo had to force the words out, stammering that he knew. A humorless chuckle escaped Julian. He knew, and yet he did it anyway. A sudden, inexplicable surge of shame and misery welled up inside Leo. He blinked rapidly, fighting the tears, but it was a losing battle. He ducked his head to hide his face, but a large teardrop splashed into his rice. Mortified, he grabbed his bowl and began shoveling food into his mouth, a desperate attempt to regain control. The rice tasted of salt. After a few frantic bites, a hand gently took the bowl and chopsticks from him. Julian's fingers brushed the tears from his cheek. His voice was softer now. He apologized for his tone, admitting he hadn't meant to yell. Hearing this only made Leo's lip tremble more. Julian pulled Leo's head against his stomach, letting him cry into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. He told Leo this had to stop, that a bad habit, no matter how ingrained, had to be broken. Leo nodded against him, a silent, sobbing promise. But a lifetime of conditioning wasn't so easily erased. He had been taught to steal by his father for as long as he could remember. Though he had sworn it was the last time he would help Rick, when the loan sharks came around and beat his father half to death, Leo couldn't just stand by and watch. He stole again. This time he wasn't caught by the law, but Julian found out. The anger was palpable. His punishment was the basement. Leo looked into the pitch-black space. There was nothing inside. No bed, no chair, no light, no ventilation. But the oppressive darkness didn't frighten him. Instead, that same strange sense of security washed over him. The darkness was a cocoon, reminding him of his childhood when his mother would lock him in a closet for being mischievous. She never hit him, just solitary confinement. She had insisted it was because she loved him, that it was to teach him, to help him remember his lessons. He remembered every single one. Then she ran off with another man. He hugged his knees, sitting on the cold concrete floor. His whole family were thieves. His mother had stolen another woman's husband. His father had stolen another man's identity for a good job, living well until he was found out and sent to prison. After his release, he became a hopeless gambling addict. And Leo stole things. He was a petty thief, a con artist, obsessed with the next score. He fell asleep like that, curled on the hard floor. He was unaware of being carried back to bed in the middle of the night. When he woke, the sky was just beginning to lighten. An arm was draped heavily over his waist. It took him a moment to realize it was Julian's arm, that he was in Julian's bed, held in his embrace. In over a month of living there, this was the first time he had ever slept in this room. His heart began to pound a frantic rhythm. He could smell the clean, masculine scent of the sheets, feel the weight of Julian's arm and the warmth of his breath on his neck. He didn't dare move for fear of waking him, his mind racing to recall how he'd gotten here. He couldn't remember a thing. He let out a soft, frustrated sigh. Julian's hand moved, rubbing his stomach gently. He asked what he was sighing about, if he was hungry. Leo froze, realizing he'd been awake the whole time. The memory of his transgression flooded back, and he fell silent with shame. Julian turned him over to face him, his voice rough with sleep. He looked Leo in the eyes and asked if he was sorry. Leo's eyelashes fluttered. He nodded, whispering that he would change. Julian insisted he look him in the eye and say it. After a moment's hesitation, Leo met his gaze and repeated the words, his voice firm. "I will change." A faint smile touched Julian's lips. He smoothed Leo's hair back from his forehead, calling him a good kid. Because of that promise, Leo behaved for a while. Julian was incredibly busy, sometimes gone for a week at a time. Leo wouldn't see him during the day, but sometimes, in a half-conscious state, he'd feel Julian slip into bed beside him late at night, only to wake in the morning to an empty, cold space beside him, making him wonder if it was just a dream. When Julian wasn't home, boredom gnawed at him. If he went out, he knew he was being followed from a distance. Julian still didn't trust him. He understood. In their world of kept boys, his reputation was the worst. He didn't want to embarrass Julian. To pass the time, he tended to the small pack of stray dogs he'd rescued over the years. He fed them the most expensive food, gave them the best care, bought them ridiculous little outfits. These dogs had been with him for 4 or 5 years. What little money he had left over from his heists had always gone to them. He'd once lost an older dog to sickness because he couldn't afford a vet, and the pain of it had never left him. He was determined to give them the best of everything he could. One evening, he came home carrying a pizza to find Julian was back, and he had guests. Leo paused in the doorway, suddenly feeling out of place. Julian made the introductions, a few of his business partners, and then gestured to Leo. Leo offered a polite hello. Julian's gaze fell on him, and he asked if he had been with the dogs. Leo, confused, nodded. Julian's brow furrowed slightly as he told him to go take a shower. Leo didn't feel particularly dirty, but he didn't argue. After showering and changing, he went to the kitchen to get plates for the pizza. From the living room, he could hear one of Julian's friends remarking on him. The boy he'd brought home a month ago. Another voice added how much he looked like Ethan. He remembered how Ethan would always shower after playing with dogs. 2. The friend commented on how Julian still remembered that habit. The knife in Leo's hand slipped, slicing into his finger. The sudden sight of blood startled the housekeeper. He assured her it was just a small cut, rinsing it under the tap. She bustled off to find a bandage. He stood there, outwardly calm, but his mind was a storm. He knew this was the reality. He was here because of a face that wasn't truly his. The fact that Julian wouldn't touch him was the ultimate proof. He was so lost in thought he didn't hear footsteps approach until the faucet was turned off. Julian took his cold, wet hand and dried it with a paper towel. It was as if Leo's turmoil was written plainly on his face. Julian spoke suddenly, his voice low. "You're not like him. You are you. He is him." Leo froze, processing the words. Yes, he was himself. And even if he looked like Ethan, he could never be him. As Julian moved to apply the bandage, Leo took it from him, saying he could do it himself. He understood the implicit in Julian's words. Rick found him when Julian was out. Leo pulled him into a secluded corner, his expression grim. Rick got straight to the point, complaining that Leo hadn't told him he'd landed a sugar daddy, leaving him to struggle. Leo watched him warily, him not to get any ideas about Julian. Rick scoffed, asking if Julian was at least giving him money. He demanded Leo give him the cash to pay off his debts. Leo lied without flinching, saying Julian didn't give him any. Rick's face twisted in disbelief, asking if he was letting the man use him for free. Leo repeated that he had no money for him. Rick reminded him not to forget his own father now that he was living the high life, insisting he get the money from Julian. Leo looked at the magnificent building behind them, a bitter taste in his mouth. He didn't want Julian's clean money tainted by his father's degenerate world. He didn't want a man like Julian entangled with a lowlife like Rick. He sighed, telling Rick he'd go out that night. Rick just grunted. He didn't care where the money came from as long as he got it. The heist landed him a watch worth $500,000. He threw it at Rick. 2 days later, Rick was caught trying to fence it. Leo was brought in as an accomplice. Lying on a cot in a holding cell, staring at the ceiling, his mind was a blank and a whirlwind all at once. Julian would be furious now. This would surely be the end. They would go their separate ways. Not that they were ever truly together. He had just been a guest who had long overstayed his welcome. He was released sooner than he expected. As he walked out of the police station, he saw Julian across the street, leaning against his car. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes sharp and analytical. A sudden chill ran through Leo, and he looked up as a gust of wind brought the first drops of rain. When he looked back, Julian was getting into his car. The vehicle pulled away, leaving a plume of exhaust hanging in the damp air. He really was being abandoned this time. He went back to his father's apartment, a place perpetually steeped in chaos and the smell of stale beer. He kicked an empty bottle out of his way and collapsed onto the sofa. Sometime in the dead of night, a soft but urgent knocking started at the door. Leo opened one eye, listening to the rattling of the flimsy wood. He closed it again, trying to ignore it. The knocking continued, and Julian's voice came through, low and commanding. He told Leo to open the door once, then twice. A few moments later, the knocking stopped. Leo thought he'd given up. But a man like Julian doesn't give up. He makes his own door. With a deafening crash of shattering glass, Julian came through the window. He stood over the sofa, looking down at Leo. He said Leo's name, his voice tight with a rage that was barely contained. Leo didn't respond. Julian ripped his arm away from his face and, without, pressed down on him, his presence heavy and suffocating. His voice was harsh, laced with a bitter disappointment. He asked if Leo was simply incapable of learning. At his words, Leo broke down and began to cry. Julian's tone grew harsher, asking what right he had to cry. His movements were rough, the slap of his hand against Leo's body stinging. Spurred by the pain or a wave of reckless despair, Leo wrapped his arms around Julian's neck and kissed him, a messy, frantic act. If this was the end, he was going to take something for himself. Julian stiffened, trying to push him away, but Leo held on, using his leverage to press Julian down beneath him. He kissed his strong nose, his sharp jawline, his cool lips. A tear fell from Leo's eye onto Julian's cheek. Everything went still. Then, a large hand cupped the back of his neck. Julian's voice was a low growl. "You started this, Leo. Don't you dare act surprised tomorrow." He was crying the entire time Julian took him on the sofa. Julian seemed frustrated by the tears, repeatedly asking him the same questions. "Can't you learn? Can't you do better? Can't you change?" Each question was like a hot brand on his soul. The pain was suffocating, the misery too deep for words. All he could do was cling to Julian's neck, his sobs muffled against his skin. When it was finally over, Julian rested his forehead against Leo's. He placed a gentle kiss on his swollen lips, his voice now a hoarse, persuasive whisper. He asked what Leo was trying to prove. Leo said nothing. He couldn't. A twisted vine of love grew in the darkness of his heart. It didn't need sunlight. It spread through him, dark and clinging. What was he testing? He was testing that love. Every time he messed up, Julian reined him in. To him, that was love. He was pushing again and again to see where the breaking point was, to see when Julian's patience would finally run out. The day his mother stopped locking him in the closet. The day she stopped caring whether he misbehaved. The day she stopped paying him any mind at all. That was the day she had stopped loving him. And then she had left to love the children she had with someone else. He began to cry harder. Julian nibbled on his earlobe, his a low threat. If he ever stole again, he would cut off his hands. Leo's crying became more desperate. He wailed about how he would eat then. Julian was silent for a second, then let out a strange, exasperated laugh. He said, with a tone of utter resignation, that he would feed him then. Leo sniffled. Julian's voice was soft beside his ear. He told him the bad habits had to go, even if it took time. He would give him any money he needed. If it wasn't enough, he'd earn more. He told him not to resort to stealing again. He would pay off his father's gambling debts. He would provide for him. All Leo had to do was break this one destructive habit. Julian wiped his tears, kissing his puffy eyelids. He asked if that was okay. Leo mumbled that it wasn't. That stolen things and given things were different. Stolen things, at least, were earned through his own twisted labor. But as the thought formed, he realized how wrong he was. A sudden wave of clarity washed over him. Stolen things and given things were exactly the same. Neither was truly his. Everything he had now, he only had because of a face that resembled Ethan's. The grief of that realization was like a tidal wave. Julian's voice was gentle, rubbing his brow. He explained that he hadn't abandoned him at the police station. He had been in the middle of a critical meeting and had rushed over. Once he saw Leo was safe, he had to go back to the office. He apologized, admitting it was his fault, and told him not to be sad. The next morning, Julian left early for work, leaving a note on the nightstand. The events of the previous night felt like a surreal dream. Leo had treated it as a final, desperate act, a goodbye. So he hadn't gone back to the penthouse. But Julian had found him again. Leo was feeding his dogs in a back alley when he heard footsteps and spun around, instinctively shielding the animals. He relaxed when he saw it was Julian. This time, however, Julian kept his distance, his brow furrowed. He told Leo to come over. He called the animals a pack of strays. An unexpected surge of emotion erupted in Leo. He retorted that they weren't strays. He was the stray. But his dogs were not. He hugged one of them to his chest, his mood plummeting. He really was a stray now. His father was in jail. Julian was done with him. Julian softened his tone, agreeing that they weren't. He clarified that he meant they needed their shots. Leo blinked, the tension draining out of him. Julian then added that Leo needed one, too. He was confused, saying he hadn't been bitten. Because Leo hadn't come home as instructed in the note. That night he received 3 sharp smacks and 1 very potent injection. He cursed Julian, calling him a bastard. Julian just laughed softly in his ear, agreeing that he was. Leo looked into his eyes and asked in a small voice why he cared, if he didn't even like dogs. Julian pinched his cheek. He told Leo to continue with his misunderstandings. He was curious to hear them all. Leo fell silent. Julian sighed. He explained that he didn't dislike dogs. He was just allergic to their fur. That was why he'd asked him to shower. A wave of guilt washed over Leo. He apologized. Julian said that words weren't enough. After a moment's hesitation, Leo leaned in and pressed a quick kiss to his lips. That seemed to improve Julian's mood considerably. He announced that there was a charity gala the next day, and Leo was going with him. At the gala, surrounded by a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns, Leo felt like an imposter. Julian, beside him, was a natural, effortlessly commanding attention with his height, his bearing, his quiet confidence. Leo felt like a sewer rat that had scurried into a palace. While Julian networked, Leo retreated to the food table, nibbling on canapes. He overheard a conversation nearby. A woman was remarking on how well Julian's business was doing, but what a shame he was still single. Another chimed in, asking about the boy from the bar he had supposedly taken in, the pretty little thief. The first woman scoffed that it was a foolish investment. They went on, their voices dripping with disdain. They mentioned the recent arrest, how Julian had to trade a valuable piece of property in a private deal just to get him out. They called him a thankless stray, more trouble than he was worth. With every word, Leo's heart sank lower. The crumbs from his pastry fell onto the polished leather of his new shoes. The shoes, the tailored suit, his clean-shaven face, it was all from Julian. And in return, all he brought was scandal and gossip. A heavy sigh escaped him. He felt a profound sadness. Suddenly, a pair of hands covered his ears from behind. A familiar voice murmured, "Don't listen to them. You're wonderful, and I like you very much." His heart did a wild, chaotic flip. He spun around to see Julian looking down at him, his eyes sincere. There were words bubbling up inside Leo, a desperate need for clarification, for certainty, but he swallowed them back down. Julian asked what was wrong. Leo just shook his head. As Julian led him by the hand to be introduced to people, Leo didn't feel reassurance. He felt fear. Fear that this glittering world was just a dream from which he would soon wake. Later, he heard Julian in his study on the phone, confirming the date of Ethan's return from abroad. After the call ended, Leo knocked softly and brought in a cup of tea. He saw the lingering smile on Julian's face and asked casually what the good news was. Julian beckoned him over. He pulled Leo into his lap and kissed him until he was breathless. Then he turned his laptop screen toward him. It showed a series of photos. A grand cathedral, rolling green hills dotted with sheep, a lake as blue as the sky. Julian said softly that he had found a beautiful place overseas, perfect for settling down. Leo's mind went blank, a loud ringing in his ears that drowned out Julian's voice. He felt disconnected, his consciousness floating somewhere outside his body. It wasn't until they were in the bathroom later and Julian, kissing his neck, mentioned he was flying out the next day to check on the place, that reality crashed back in. He managed to force out a single word. Good. The next morning, he saw Julian off at the door. Julian smiled and gave him a hug, telling him to be good. Leo watched his car disappear down the drive before turning back into the silent house. An overwhelming sense of finality washed over him. Ethan was coming back. It was time for him to leave. Remaining in this city was pointless. His father was locked up, and he had no desire to witness Julian and Ethan's happy reunion. He decided to move to the next state over a change of scenery. He packed a single bag and decided to take one of the dogs with him for company. He called for a ride from a cheap moving service. A few miles down the road, passing one of his old haunts, he realized in his haste he'd forgotten to take any money. The funds Julian had given him were in a separate bank account he hadn't touched. He couldn't let his dog go hungry. After a long internal debate, his pride warring with his pragmatism, he decided to text Julian. He didn't want to sound pathetic or reveal his location, so he adopted his old persona, the brazen, entitled hustler. He typed, "Julian, you got a lot of cash on you? Wire me some if you do. I'm broke, and don't think I'm shameless for asking. Think about it. All those suits you wear, who bought them? You. All that fancy food you eat, who paid for it? You. Don't you think it's a little selfish to buy all that stuff for yourself and none for me?" The reply was instantaneous. A notification for a $200,000 transfer, followed by a message. "That's the single transaction limit. Get back home now." Leo's head snapped up, scanning the street. He saw no one. He typed back, asking where Julian was. The reply came, "Never mind where I am, or I can have my people drag you out of that bar right now." The little rat. He had someone watching the old places. Leo refused to be caught. He bought a cheap burner phone, transferred his contacts, then snapped the SIM card from his old phone and tossed it. He got into the waiting truck and left the city behind. After half an hour on the highway, he was confident Julian had only been watching the bar, not actively tracking him. The dog was happy, and his own spirits began to lift. He spent 2 weeks in the new city. One afternoon, he took the dog to a park. The dog romped on the grass with other pets while Leo lay back, a blade of grass between his teeth, dozing in the warm sun. The weather was perfect, but his mood was sour. By his calculations, Julian should have been back for a week. They were probably together by now. Julian hadn't even tried to find him. Then again, he reminded himself he was the one who left. He closed his eyes and clasped his hands on his chest in mock prayer, asking the heavens to please grant him another rich patron. As if on cue, a shadow fell over him. He opened his eyes and looked straight into the face of Julian Vance. His first instinct was to run, but a hand shot out and clamped around his wrist, pulling him back down. Julian sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. He asked why he was running, saying he was just settling things for their move, not selling him off. Leo's mind was still foggy. The move? With him? He voiced the question aloud. Julian looked down at him, raising an eyebrow. "Of course with you. Who else?" Leo asked if it wasn't supposed to be Ethan. Julian's fingers tightened, pinching his cheek. His voice was laced with frustration. He asked if his feelings for Leo were really that unnoticeable, or if Leo was just dense. Throwing his affection away on someone who refused to see it, who only listened to his own twisted interpretations. Julian was clearly angry. The journey back to the hotel was a blur of Leo asking why. Why him? Why, if he liked him, had he never... He caught himself before he said it. He asked why everyone said Ethan was his great love. Julian demanded to know who said that. Leo mumbled it was what everyone said, that they even looked alike. Julian pressed him, wanting names. He pointed out that he had never said that. Leo shot back that he had never denied that Ethan was his old flame, either. Julian scoffed at the absurdity of it. How could he deny something no one had ever said to his face? Was he supposed to just shout into the void that a list of random people weren't his great loves? He explained that Ethan was a high school classmate who'd had a crush on him. He wasn't interested. They kept in touch occasionally after he moved abroad, as friends. That was it. He grew more agitated as he spoke, baffled at how Leo had constructed this entire narrative of being a replacement. He asked why Leo listened to gossip instead of just asking him. He said he had been furious, but he'd assumed Leo had run off because he was scared of moving to a new country. So he'd given him space, letting him have a week to cool off while he handled work. He couldn't believe Leo had actually thought he was running off to start a new life with someone else. Leo then asked if they had known each other before that night in the alley. Julian's tone turned sarcastic. Of course, the great man has forgotten. He remembered now. A night there was a blackout. He'd stumbled home, drunk, and found a man bleeding from a stab wound on his doorstep. Fearing a corpse outside his apartment, he dragged Julian inside and used the last of a bandage to wrap his wound. The man had been delirious all night, asking for water and food. But the streets were dark, and his own cupboards were bare. Julian's voice pulled him from the memory. He recalled how poor Leo had been, how much he had struggled, yet he had told him the food he gave him was the most expensive thing he owned. He said he was moved, that he would never forget the taste. Leo bit his lip, admitting quietly that he hadn't told the truth back then. It was dog food. He quickly added that he swore it was, in fact, the most expensive food in the house. There was a stunned silence. Then Julian let out a short, sharp laugh. "Leo, you are unbelievable." He was furious, but in a completely different way now. Julian Vance, when truly angry, was difficult to appease. Kisses didn't work. Offering himself didn't work. Sweet words made him angrier. Ignoring him was not an option. Julian said he was furious and didn't want to be talked to, but if Leo actually dared to ignore him, he was finished. Leo took the offered olive branch immediately. He hugged him, cajoled him, and finally said he was hungry. Julian told him to go eat dog food. Leo looked at his own dog and decided against it. Back at the penthouse, Julian made him sleep in a separate room. A small test of wills. If he was being exiled to the guest room, Leo would just go back to his own squalid apartment. He had his pride, too. The next morning, he was woken by the sounds of cooking. He got up and opened his bedroom door to see Julian sitting on the sofa. His eyes lit up, and he had to physically restrain himself from running to him. Julian spoke first, his voice gruff. He told him to wash up and come eat breakfast. At the table, a plate of scrambled eggs was set before him. Leo asked if he had made it. Julian looked away, dismissively saying he hadn't. Leo nodded, commenting blandly that he could tell, since there were still bits of eggshell in it. Julian immediately shot up and came over to inspect the plate, insisting he had been very careful. Leo met his eyes and smiled. He was lying. Julian huffed and went back to the sofa. The eggs were actually good. After he finished, Leo went over and kissed his cheek. Thanks. He held out his hand. Let's go. Julian looked at him. Go where? Leo said, Aren't you here to take me home? He wiggled his fingers. Don't be angry anymore. I'm not trying to get revenge on rich people. And that dog food really was the most expensive thing I owned. From now on, I'll ask you things directly. I won't listen to gossip. Forgive me, please? He blinked at him pleadingly. Julian stood up. He looked at the outstretched hand, then took it, his fingers lacing with Leo's. As they walked out the door, he heard Julian's voice, a note of pleasure in it now. That place I went to see. It really is perfect for settling down. Leo nodded. Then let's go. As he said it, something cool and metallic slipped onto his ring finger. He looked down and saw a band of glittering diamonds. Julian squeezed his hand, his voice full of satisfaction. There. Now you're caught. Leo was still for a second. Then he leaned over and kissed Julian's cheek. Yes. Caught for good.